Hello class, this is Wade Renando, and this is Chapter 11 on Globalization and Diversity, 5th edition, East Asia. East Asia consists of China, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and Taiwan, at least as defined by our textbook. It's historically a unified culture. It has similar interconnected culture, unique language, unique philosophical ideology, and other things that unite the region. Politically and ideologically, it is currently divided by the Cold War. During the Cold War, the region was divided into capitalist countries such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and then the communist bloc of China and North Korea. Since the end of the Cold War in the late 80s and early 90s, relations between the U.S. and the capitalist countries and China have improved, while North Korea still remains communist and very isolated. This is the physical geography of the region. China is far and away the largest country in the region. It's about the size of the continental United States. And about 95% of the population in China live in the eastern third, roughly, sometimes called China proper. That is roughly this area here, and then it gets more sparsely populated as you move west. The region has a similar latitude to the United States. It's about at the same latitude as the U.S. is. Southern China is similar to Florida, and northern China, Manchuria, is similar to New England. And China is the largest. Japan is about the size of California, and Taiwan is smaller. Hong Kong is actually a city-state that was independent from China and merged with China in 1997. And North Korea and South Korea are both about the size of Minnesota. So this is an area that has a great deal of variety in climate. A lot of the climate is mid-latitude mild. Some of it is continental. It has huge mountain ranges, the Himalayas. So it has a wide variety of climates, and then some tropical regions in the south. The area is vulnerable to earthquakes. In China, they get fewer of them compared to Japan, but they're often more severe and cause more damage. And in Japan, they have more of them, but they have buildings that are built a little better and more sturdy, so they don't typically cause as much damage. And the area is also occasionally vulnerable to tsunamis as well. So China has more than 1.38 billion people in it, and it's the dominant country in the region and the largest country in the world. Second largest country population-wise is India. Most demographers predict India will surpass China population-wise in roughly 8 years because it's growing faster. Japan is about 127 million people, again in the area about the size of California, which has about 38 million. Japan's population is stable. It's not really growing at all. It might even start declining soon. China has recently surpassed Japan and South Korea as the leading economic and political force in the region. As little as 4 to 6 years ago, Japan had a larger economy, but China's economy has been growing pretty steadily for a long time, and it now, by most accounts, is the second largest economy in the world after the United States. South Korea has about 50.2 million people. North Korea has about 24.4 million, and Taiwan has about 23.4 million. So the physical geography and the environmental issues of the area. This is an area that has somewhat limited natural resources due to the large population. These countries do have a fair amount of natural resources such as lumber and mining, coal and other things, but because of the large populations, they have to import a lot of food and energy and raw materials from outside. China receives a vast amount of raw materials such as coal and food such as rice and others from Australia. Australia has actually had almost over 20 years of economic growth, largely because they have given so much raw materials to China. So these two countries have a very close economic relationship to each other. But although the area does have some natural resources, because of the large population, they have to import a lot of what they eat and a lot of the raw materials. The picture on the bottom left is a street in Tokyo. Tokyo, the city proper, has about 13.6 million, and the metropolitan area, which means the market, roughly everything within a commutable distance of downtown Tokyo, is about 37.8 million, and that's the largest metropolitan area in the world. The latitudinal range, again, is similar to the United States. The northern tip of China is about the same latitude as Quebec in Canada, and southern China has a similar climate to Florida. Japan, as you can see here, has a fairly mild climate. It has the southern part of it is similar to perhaps the Carolinas, and the northern part is somewhat of a continental climate, even though much of it is near the ocean, with 4 distinct seasons. And then, as you can see, as you get to northern China, parts of it are a steppe and desert, and then there's a very large gray area, which is the highland complex mountain climates. That is where the Himalayan plateau is. And then if you look, Taiwan is this country right here, and that is also mid-latitude mild. So quite a bit of variation in climate because it's a pretty big geographic area, and it's a similar latitude and has a similar variety of climates to what you might see in North America. So again, this is diverse climate in different environments. In China, the northern part of China is a little drier, and the southern part is more humid. The very northeastern part of China is called Manchuria. It has cold winters and warmer summers, somewhat like New England would be. And then as you get further south, it's somewhat like Florida or more tropical regions, which is significantly warmer. Here's some pictures of northern China. North of the Yangtze River, that's kind of the dividing line between north and south. It's colder to the north. The northern plain of China is subject to desertification, meaning the Gobi Desert, which is in the northern part of China, has been slowly growing and moving further south. And then the picture on the bottom left is of Manchuria, and parts of Manchuria is a broad and open fertile lowland. So some of it actually does have some good farmland, but a wide variety of climates in northern China. Southern China is tropical. It has large valleys and plateaus. The coastal areas have a lot of bays and inlets. There are a lot of small fishing villages in this region. There's somewhat limited agriculture because of some of the mountainous terrain in parts of it, but fishing is still a fairly common way of life. So warmer, the picture on the top is of terraced rice paddies. It's common for people to cultivate a hill, to have steppes, flat areas that make it easier to cultivate rice. And there is a significant amount of rice in southern parts of China where there's more rain to help support the crop. So Japan's physical environment has lowland plains mostly along the coastlines. These are where a lot of the big cities are. Rugged mountains as you move upward into the interior of the country. And numerous volcanoes. Earthquakes are relatively common. Fairly fertile soil where they do have farmland. And this is where 3 different tectonic plates meet. As you can see, the Philippine plate, the Pacific plate, and the Eurasian plate. And these 3 plates rubbing up and colliding with each other mean that this is a fairly active area when it comes to volcanoes and earthquakes. Here are some pictures of Japan. On the top left is Mount Fuji. It's 12,388 feet tall. The picture on the top right is some Japanese coast, fairly rugged. The picture on the bottom left is a bamboo forest. A bamboo is technically a type of grass. It can grow very quickly. And there are parts of Japan that have large bamboo forests. And the picture on the bottom right is of the city of Kyoto. And some cities in Japan have protected land on the outskirts of the city to help rein in what we might call suburban sprawl. And you can very clearly see in the picture on the bottom right the city and then the protected forest just outside the city. And sometimes these areas are called green belts. Some large cities have areas right around the edge of the city that you're not allowed to build or develop. London has somewhat of a green belt. They're not as common in the US, but Kyoto is an example of a city in Japan, like some others that have protected green space around a city that try to rein in sprawl and protect the forests and protect farmland. Sort of the opposite of some of the Sunbelt cities in the US that have sprawled out in all directions. So the Korean landscape, both North and South Korea, have a significant amount of mountains, large rivers. There is more agriculture in the lowland parts of South Korea, and North Korea is still very heavily forested. Both North and South Korea have had large areas that have been deforested. Land has been cut and cleared for forests for lumber. And South Korea especially has had some success actually reforesting large parts of forest that had been previously cut. So there have been some successful attempts at preserving land, having parks set aside as open space, and then reforesting some of the land. Taiwan's environment is similar to Korea or Japan, meaning it's mountainous, it's somewhat seismically active. It's about the size of Maryland. It's an island that is vulnerable to typhoons, and it has a lot of extensive forests in the uplands, meaning away from the coast and in the mountainous areas. Taiwan is interesting. I had a sister-in-law that went to Taiwan because her husband had a friend getting married there, and it doesn't get a lot of tourists. It's kind of a long flight there, and because of that, she's about 5'7", and her husband's about 6 feet, and they were giants in Taiwan, and there were strangers coming up to them because they hadn't seen Westerners before, and even asking to have their picture taken with them. And she said she wanted to buy clothes there because the clothes were very cheap, but none of the clothes fit because she was 5'7", and none of the clothes were for anyone taller than about 5'3". They're just a little shorter there. But it sounds like a really interesting and beautiful island to visit, somewhat like Hawaii as far as the climate goes, except much more urban and built up. Here are some pictures of the physical geography of Taiwan. On the top left is Yushan Mountain with an elevation of 12,000 feet. It's the highest point in Taiwan. And then the Naidong Forest Recreation Area is on the top right. This is some farmland on the top left, and then the largest city is Taipei, the largest city in Taiwan. So East Asia has had some environmental challenges. They've built a massive dam, the Three Gorges Dam, largest in the world, that was completed a little over a decade ago. That's helped generate electricity, but it's also caused some environmental problems. They've had issues with soil erosion. They've had a significant tsunami that was caused by an earthquake that hit Japan in 2011. The Yangtze River, the dividing line traditionally between North and South China, occasionally has flooded, and that's part of the reason why they wanted to dam it. And there's been some deforestation in southern China. So some of the same environmental issues that are affecting many of the other regions of the world are affecting East Asia as well. So the 2011 tsunami it struck on March 11th, 2011, and it was caused by an earthquake that happened shortly, a little bit offshore of Japan. Over 20,000 people died, and numerous coastal fishing villages were destroyed. Japan did invest a lot of money in anti-tsunami seawalls that were supposed to protect the coast from tsunamis, but they simply weren't tall enough. This was a massive tsunami, and it just flooded right over the seawalls, and you had this giant wall of water that not only had the mass of the water, but also had soil and debris as it moved inland, and it devastated a lot of small villages and caused a lot of devastation. About 900 towns and 960 fishing boats were ruined by this. In addition to that, the earthquake damaged a nuclear power plant. You probably heard of this. The Fukushima nuclear power plant was damaged by the earthquake and by the tsunami. 200,000 people were evacuated, and eventually the immediate danger was suppressed. But even now, the area has high levels of radiation, and people have not moved into the area. And it also caused a crisis of confidence with the Japanese people. They didn't think their government was very forthright and honest with what was going on and how bad the damage was. So some people lost some trust in their government, which they're usually fairly trusting in. It's generally a pretty straightforward, competent government, and this shattered some confidence that the public had with their government, allowing this to happen and not explaining to the people how bad it was. Now Japan is in the process of shutting down other nuclear plants because they're worried that this might happen again, and they're trying to move towards wind and solar and natural gas as a way of phasing out nuclear as quickly as possible. But it's expensive to import a lot of that energy because they don't have enough within their country to support themselves. And this is a picture of Fukushima about a year or two ago, and as you can see, it's a ghost town. I don't know how this ostrich is there. Apparently there was a zoo he got out of, but much like Chernobyl near Russia, this is an area that people have not gone back to because of concerns of radiation and radiation poisoning. So East Asia has other environmental challenges. One of them is pollution. Beijing, China, is one of the most polluted cities in the world, although New Delhi is giving them a run for their money and probably considered worse. A lot of air pollution is caused by coal-fired power plants. China surpassed the U.S. in 2008 as the country that gives off the most greenhouse gases, although China is working to try to reduce the pollution they cause. Some countries like Korea and Japan do something called pollution exporting, which is where they have very tight environmental regulations in their country, and they have factories overseas in other countries where the standards are lower that give off pollution. So essentially they literally export the pollution to other countries where the standards to protect the environment are not as strong. Again, this is an area that's also had problems with deforestation, like all around the world. The picture is of eastern China over Beijing, and the clouds you see is smog and pollution caused mostly by coal-fired power plants. Sometimes scientists think about 20% of the air pollution in Los Angeles might have originated from China and then just drifted over the Pacific. So it's a major problem. Here are some more pictures of Beijing. Again, coal is a major contributing factor to the pollution. About 16 out of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are in China. Most of the others are in India as far as air pollution goes. Sometimes the air is so bad, it's comparable to smoking, say, 2.5 packs of cigarettes a day. That's how bad it would be if you were outside for about 4 hours in the pollution. So it is pretty bad, and people often buy masks if they have to go outside. Sometimes they'll buy expensive air purifiers if they have an apartment, and just try to avoid going outside unless they have to, and it's especially bad usually in the winter. In addition to air pollution, China has had problems with industrial waste. This is metals that have been given off by a dye factory that have contaminated soil. China's government declared war on pollution in 2014, but there have been problems with environmental pollution, and heavy metals like lead and cadmium have leached out of factories that have been used for dyeing from time to time. And there have also been problems with food scares where food has been contaminated and has been unsafe to eat because of pollution. So as one of the worst examples of contaminated food was in 2005. In 2005, 110 people were arrested for selling pork from diseased pigs. And in 2013, 900 pigs died and were pulled out of the Shanghai River. And when you think this is where a lot of people are getting their drinking water from, that's pretty scary that and authorities don't even know where these dead pigs came from. So pollution and food contamination is a major concern in China that China is trying to crack down on and improve. We think of Walmart as a place where we go to buy cheap stuff made in China, but Walmart is a massive global company, and they have a lot of shops in China. And in China, it's where middle-class people go to buy high-end goods imported from the United States. It's kind of backwards of what it would be here. People who have the money and the means, who want to buy higher quality food that's less likely to be contaminated or poisoned, will go to Walmart and they'll buy beef that's imported from the United States, often from the Carolinas, and pork also imported often from the US. So while we go to Walmart to buy cheap stuff manufactured in China, wealthier people often go there to buy higher quality food imported from the US or Australia or elsewhere. So again, this is because sometimes they don't trust the quality and safety of their own food. Pollution in China is so bad that it's causing wealthy Chinese to leave the country. In 2014, a survey was conducted and it showed 60% of wealthy Chinese people had already emigrated or were likely to emigrate to another country. because of concerns about jobs and pollution and often quality of life issues. The countries that they were most likely trying to immigrate to, about 52% to the US, 21% to Canada, many in Vancouver. Vancouver has a large number of Chinese immigrants. Australia is a common destination for Chinese immigrants leaving China to another country. And then Europe, New Zealand, and Singapore were also up there. But again, concerns of pollution, food safety, better education, and quality of life issues are causing some Chinese people who are upper middle class to leave the country. In Japan, they have, again, stricter standards when it comes to pollution. So generally, the country is a little cleaner, the food is safer. It also has very high population density. Tokyo, again, is the largest metro area in the world. They have very crowded cities, and crowded cities mean mass transit is often more practical than owning a car. And after pollution in the 1950s and 60s was pretty bad, Japan passed strict environmental laws to try to reduce pollution, which had been somewhat successful. The US did something similar during the 1970s. The picture on the top right is of Tokyo, and the picture on the bottom right is of people getting onto a subway in Tokyo during rush hour. And they actually have ushers whose job it is to physically shove people inside of a subway and close the door so they can fit as many people in the subway as possible. So this is something that they're just used to, having someone shove you in the subway and then close the door on you. Japan has pretty strong winds that blow some of the pollution they might accumulate over to the ocean. So they have nature that's kind of working in their favor to help reduce pollution. Certain cities in the US are like that too. Chicago is fairly windy, although it's not by any means the windiest city. So some of the pollution around Chicago is kind of blown over Lake Michigan. And then you have cities such as Denver, which are often in or near valleys, where pollution tends to accumulate and it can't disperse. Parts of California are like that too. So living in a city that's relatively flat with steady wind can actually do a lot to help reduce pollution compared to living in a place like, say, Mexico City, where you're in a valley and the air can build up and become stagnant and can't circulate. So pollution exporting, as we mentioned earlier, having factories owned by companies in your country overseas where the pollution doesn't bother the people in Japan is fairly common. And Japan's pollution is partly displaced by poor countries. Japan and Germany have many factories that are used to manufacture cars in the United States. Ohio has a lot of Japanese car companies that work there. Land and labor is cheaper in the US than it is in Japan. And if you make Japanese cars in the US, then you don't have to pay for the transportation of moving a car from Japan all the way over to the US. So building cars in the market near where they're sold makes a lot of sense in the global economy. So forests and deforestation, most upland areas in China and Korea have grass and shrubs and stunted trees, sometimes because of overforestation and a cold environment. Centuries of overuse in some of the higher areas have led to soil erosion. When you have deforestation, the roots that lock down the soil, that the trees are there holding it down, go away, and sometimes you can have massive amounts of soil erosion. Soil falls down hills, goes into rivers, and seeps away. And China in the north has had especially problems with deforestation and erosion. The picture on the bottom right is of the Moragana National Forest in northern China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. That's basically a northern part of China. And this is an example of land like a national park that has been set aside for nature. And when you protect land, you can significantly reduce or stop deforestation. So flooding, dams, and soil erosions are a problem in this region, especially in China. The Yangtze River is the world's third largest river by volume. It's China's main transportation corridor, flowing from east to west. And it's known for its beauty as well. Parts of it are very pretty. It's often mentioned in Chinese poetry, and it's a major part of Chinese history, somewhat like the Mississippi might be with American history. And this is a picture of the Yangtze River on the bottom right. Here's some more pictures of the Yangtze River. Again, a lot of the area along the river is very mountainous. A lot of it is fairly fertile farmland, some small villages. So a lot of activity along the Yangtze River. The Three Gorges Dam was built to try to control flooding along the Yangtze River, and it was built over several years and completed in 2006. It's vastly larger than the Hoover Dam, which is one of the largest dams in the U.S. It costs about $39 billion to build, and it's far and away the largest hydroelectric dam in the world, and it creates about 3% of China's electricity. It helped also prevent flooding. The Yangtze River occasionally flooded, but the problem is by having this huge river, it's created a massive reservoir that has backed up water for hundreds of miles behind the dam, and that has caused soil along this new reservoir to become saturated. And then there have been some slides and some spills where soil has eroded, mudslides and other slides where sometimes entire villages have fallen into this reservoir. So it's caused some problems as well as solved some problems. And although it does generate 3% of electricity for the country, and that's significant, it's also displaced hundreds of thousands of people because of this massive reservoir behind it and because of the erosion that it's caused. So some of the worst flooding was along the Yellow River. That's a river that's a little further north. It's called the Yellow River because of the large amounts of soil and soot that's in it. It gives it almost a yellow color. Upstream erosion on the Honghe or Yellow River has created a huge sediment load in this river. It means it's a very dirty, muddy river. The mud collects in low-lying plains to the east and then comes down the river during heavy rains and brings this really thick, dirty, muddy water along to the banks of the Yellow River. So the level of the river raises above the surrounding land. It can flood the land around it. So the Yellow River, in addition to the Yangtze, is also prone to flooding. So in northern China, they have large sediments of soil called loess, and loess is basically very fine soil, almost like talcum powder, that is deposited from the wind from really the Himalayas. It's basically soil that's been deposited along the Himalayas by rivers, and then this fine dust kind of accumulates, and then it creates these large mounds of very fine soil called loess soil. There are some spots similar to this in parts of the Midwest, and it's very fertile soil, but because it is so fine, it can crumble and erode very easily too. So this has caused parts of northern China to be very productive farmland, but if you're not careful, this farmland can erode into the Yellow River and elsewhere and leave an area barren. The area on the top picture is an area that is no longer farmable because of erosion, and the picture on the bottom right shows corn that is being raised in this special type of soil called loess soil. Climate change is a major issue in East Asia, as everywhere. And this graph here shows energy use in China from 1965 to 2014. As you can see, there's been a huge rise in oil and coal, and somewhat of an increase in natural gas and hydroelectric power, but especially oil and especially coal. China's rapid growth starting in the late 80s, early 90s has meant it's had an almost insatiable desire for raw materials and power in order to fund the increased number of factories and industrialization. China has invested in renewable energy and wants to also improve energy efficiency, but at the moment they consume vast amounts of fossil fuels. So in 2007, China adopted plans to combat climate change by investing in renewable energy. And China and Europe and the United States have about 62% of the world's total installed renewable energy capacity as of about a year ago. India is actually very rapidly investing in solar as well, as are parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But at the moment, Europe, especially Germany and the United States and China, have over 60% of the world's renewable energy sources are in those countries, in Europe and the United States and China. So the population of the region is not evenly distributed. Coastal areas have a higher population, as is often the case. In China, the eastern third has a very high population because of good soil and good farmland. Tokyo, again, is pretty densely populated, although they do have large parts of Japan that are still wilderness. So, almost 60 to 70% of Japan is still fairly rural because of a lot of protected land. And then Taipei is also densely populated along the low-lying coastal areas. And you can see here the Sichuan Basin is interesting because this is an area in the interior of China that has a very high dense population. But most of the densest parts of China are around Beijing and around Shanghai and along the coasts here that rim the Pacific. And then the areas further to the west are much, much more lightly populated. This area here is Tibet, and that is an area that China annexed in the mid-20th century, and some people in Tibet would like complete autonomy from China, while some people want China to invest more in their region and better integrate them into the economy further to the east. So this is an example of a choropleth map, and the redder it is, the higher the population density. And most of the big cities and the big populations in all the countries are along the coasts. This is an example of China proper that we've talked a little bit about. And China, of course, has a very, very long history. And what we think of as the nation state of China today wasn't always what historically China had been. It's an area that had often been broken up into multiple kingdoms that had expanded and contracted. At times, China controlled what is now Mongolia, this country here. At times, Mongolian invaders had controlled parts of China. And throughout history, China had occasionally controlled and then lost control of Tibet, this Tibetan plateau. But the eastern, roughly half, has consistently been what we think of as China. And there's a large ethnic group called the Han Chinese that is the dominant ethnic group in China proper. And about 80% of the country of China is Han Chinese, and then the rest is Tibetan, Mongolian, and other ethnic groups within China. But China proper is the densely populated part of China that has historically been dominated by the Han Chinese. So here's population settlement. It's an area that generally is heavily populated, heavily urban, with relatively low total fertility rates. China's is 1.7, Hong Kong's is very low, 1.2. That means the average woman would have just barely one children. Women that have two or three would be relatively rare. And Japan is low at 1.4. North Korea is about like the US at 2.0. Enough natural birth rate to have a relatively stable population. South Korea and Taiwan, like Hong Kong, is very low at 1.2. So most of the area has low total fertility rate, large percentage of people that are living in urban areas. China is the lowest at only 55%. And the percent below the age of 15 is relatively low compared to other countries. Generally, these countries have fairly good health care and fairly long life expectancies. So it's an area that's largely urban with fairly low fertility rates in most of the areas. This is a population pyramid that compares China and Japan. And Japan, as you can see, is a little wider at the top. They had, as you can see, there's a large bulge around the ages 60 to 64, and that is the baby boom. We in the U.S. had a baby boom after World War II, and Japan did as well. World War II was very devastating to Japan, and after Japan got through World War II, they had a significant amount of investment from the U.S. during the Korean War, when Japan and the U.S. were allies against China and North Korea. And the economy rebounded, and in the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, there was a big baby boom in Japan, like in the U.S. You'll also notice that above the age of 85, there are far, far more women than men. It's typical to have more women than men above the year of 85, but in Japan, there were so many Japanese who died during World War II, mostly men, that there's a huge skew towards more women than men above the age of 85 for Japan. In China, uh, the the curve is a little wider and a little lower compared to Japan. They typically don't have as long of a life expectancy, and it's a little wider at the base. And then there are kind of two baby booms in Japan, those between 20 and 24, and those between 40 and 50, and so on. So a slightly younger population in China compared to Japan. Japanese settlements and agricultural patterns. Japan, again, is highly urbanized, and a large portion of it is unsuitable for farming because it's too mountainous or the land is protected. So that means often any parcel of land that can be farmed is. And you'll sometimes see small suburban and urban farms in Japan where people grow rice or farm on any land they can get because of the high demand for food and relatively small amount of farmland. So intensive farming practices on the limited lowlands that they have is very common, and rice is very common too. That's a staple food in Japan and much of East Asia. So a little more information on Japanese settlement patterns. Major cities again are located in some of the lowland areas. Tokyo and Osaka are two very large areas that have almost run into each other because they are so large, creating a megapolis. And Japan's effective population density is even higher than it might sound on paper because so much of the people do live in some of these large coastal cities, and so much of the country is still surprisingly rural. The picture on the bottom right shows a remote village in Japan that's experiencing population loss. In Japan, like in many parts of the world, young people are moving to cities for more job opportunities, getting out of the rural lifestyle. Farms are becoming larger and more mechanized, and smaller farms are fading away. So much like in parts of the U.S., especially North or South Dakota, some of the smaller villages are emptying out of young people as they move to cities to get education and seek opportunity. The Korean Peninsula is interesting. The picture on the right shows a picture from space of South Korea, Japan, and North Korea, and it's striking how bright Seoul is in South Korea here and how dark most of North Korea is here. North Korea just is not as lit up as South Korea, and that's because it simply is not as developed. Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, is a small speck right here, and it just shows how significantly how rural and undeveloped North Korea is compared to southern China and South Korea. It's really very striking. Taiwan is about the size of the Netherlands, and the highest population density in East Asia is in Taiwan. So South Korea has large mountainous areas that are fairly lightly settled, somewhat like Japan. It has about 73 million people in it, and most people live in the low-lying coastal areas. In South Korea, a very common crop is rice because of the warmer climate. And in North Korea, corn is fairly common, and wheat because it's usually a little cooler. The picture on the top is of a small urban walkway and river that goes through the heart of Seoul, Korea. And that is actually a linear park called Cheongo-chen River Project. It's 7 miles long, and it's basically a recreational space that goes right down the middle of Seoul, Korea. And it's a very popular destination for strolling and for romantic evenings in the city. There's not a lot of green space in Seoul, so they take advantage of what they have. That waterway is interesting because it actually used to be a huge freeway. And there was a stream once a long time ago, and the stream was covered up after the Korean War with this huge, massive highway on the top left. And then in early 2000s, some urban planners thought, what if we ripped out that highway and tried to bring back that natural stream that was there? And that was the idea behind it. And then in 2005, this linear park opened up, and now it's very popular with locals and tourists. And the picture on the bottom right shows how popular it is during the day. It's just a real beautiful park and an otherwise big concrete jungle of an area. It's also very popular at night. So settlement and agricultural patterns in Taiwan. Again, Taiwan is the most densely populated and The big cities are low-lying areas near the coasts. Taiwan's population density is 646 people per square kilometer, which is almost double of what Japan's is. And this is an area, what little agriculture they have is often used for growing rice because they have a good climate for that. So East Asia, agriculture and resources in the global context, again, overall, they import more food than they grow. They do have very productive farms, but demand is simply larger than supply, which is why China especially has been investing a significant amount of money in Brazil and in parts of Africa to try to secure enough farmland and access to raw materials to meet the growing demands of the country. China especially has had a lot of investments in Eastern Africa. So we'll see if that pays off. It could be very beneficial to both some African countries and China if they can strike a good working relationship. Again, the relationship between Australia and China has been pretty productive for both countries, having Australia sell them food and raw materials that they can't produce themselves. So China has had a long history of cities and urban areas, as other cities, other countries in the region have. There's a wide variety of architecture in China, some traditional, some European influences. Beijing and Shanghai have a lot of historic buildings. Shanghai's boomed a lot in the early to mid 20th century and continues to grow quickly. And then Hong Kong, as I mentioned, is actually bought by the British in 1897 as basically a charter city or land that was owned by Great Britain. And then Great Britain managed that city for 100 years, and in 1997 the lease ran out and they gave it back to mainland China. But East Asia in general has a long tradition of strong urban networks. The picture on the bottom right is of the Grand Canal, and that is a canal that runs north-south and links some of the major east-west rivers in China. China had many rivers that ran east-west, but not many that went north to south. So over hundreds of years, the Grand Canal was built. It's about 1,400 years old, and it's still in use today for some freight and for a lot of tourists. There was a lot of economic growth in the late 20th century in China that was followed by rapid urbanization and industrialization. The picture on the top right is of an old neighborhood in Beijing that's hundreds of years old. And then, as again, the Grand Canal was built over centuries and has been in use for about 1,400 years. These are some interesting buildings. This style of building, these weird circular apartments, are common in a city called Fujian in southeast China. And they're built by Han Chinese who migrated from the northern parts of China to the southern part of China about 1,000 years ago. And they were occupied by large extended families. And these weird circular buildings were built to basically protect the families from essentially bandits and marauding armies. You know, occasionally you hear about how in the Old West you have forts that were designed to protect against Indian attacks, and it was kind of the same idea. The Han Chinese moved into this area where Hans were an ethnic minority, and they built these large fortified circular apartments that were housed with extended families that were somewhat protected by any marauding armies or bandits that might be passing by. And many of these are still well preserved. So some other interesting architectural things about China. A lot of old Chinese cities had a defensive wall around them. One of the best examples of this is the Forbidden City in Beijing. It was built to basically be the capital of one of the kingdoms in China at the time. It was built up in the 1400s, and it is this massive complex of palaces surrounded by a moat and a wall. And it's an example of late medieval architecture in Japan. And then China, and then large parts of China were also colonized by Europeans in the late 1800s, and they left their mark as well. There are many buildings in China that were built by or influenced by the British and the French and other European powers. The picture on the bottom right is of a business district with Western-style buildings. And these pictures, Hong Kong Bank is on the top left. The Shanghai Bank was the biggest in the world in 1860. Again, it's called the Hong Kong Bank, but it's actually in Shanghai. The picture on the bottom right is the Catholic Church that was built in 1902 in Xinjiang in southern China. And a new suburb of Hangzhou in the bottom left. It looks like it's Paris, France, but that's actually a large planned suburban community of Hangzhou in China. It's an odd trend in China where large planned suburban communities are often built in a style that looks like a European country. And the picture on the bottom right is also a suburb built near Hangzhou, designed to look like a German Bavarian country. So it's unusual having these European-looking landscapes built in suburbs of big Chinese cities, but that's kind of a big trend in China at the moment. They're not building their cities to look like the suburban sprawl we have in parts of the US. So here's more pictures of the two biggest cities in China. Beijing is the largest city in the north and the capital. It has about 24.9 million people in the metro area. And Shanghai is a little further south. That's a little newer, doesn't have as many historic buildings. It has more of a European influence, grew rapidly in the late 20th century, and that's also very high as population-wise with about 24.1 million. So they're both about the same size at roughly 24 million in the metro areas. Hong Kong, again, is a city that was founded by the British in 1897 as a massive trading post, basically a way to get access to the interior of China and trade with China. And it was turned back over to the Chinese mainland in 1997. This is a city-state, or it was. Now technically it's part of China, but it's semi-autonomous, somewhat like Puerto Rico is to the US. But it has a population density of 6,487 people per kilometer. So that's a very dense. About 7.2 million people live in Hong Kong. And again, it was formerly a British colony, transferred back to the Chinese in 97. They also have a lot of outside escalators as a way of moving people around. In airports, we sometimes have these moving walkways in an airport. Well, it's kind of like that, except it's outside, and some of them are elevators as well. So because it's densely populated, they need to look for creative ways to move people around. China has had a massive migration of people from rural areas into urban areas in the last roughly 30 years. About 100 million people are expected to move into Chinese cities by 2020. China has built huge cities in areas where they expected to have rapid growth as a way of trying to stave off some of the slums that have sprouted up in other parts of the world. And some of these cities are slowly growing, but some of these cities are overbuilt. And we hear about Chinese ghost towns, and these are massive, huge cities that China built expecting to have people move into them that at the moment are only sparsely populated. And it's becoming a real problem. And some people are concerned that China might have a real estate bubble burst, similar to what the U.S. did in 2008, where a lot of this real estate that has been built up but sits unoccupied might create an economic crisis and significantly damage the Chinese economy. I've been talking about this for 3 years since I've been teaching this class, and the real estate bubble in China hasn't burst yet, but I and a lot of economists think any day now you could have a significant real estate correction in China, similar to what the U.S. went through in 2008, 2009. So city systems in Japan and South Korea, these two countries have what you might call urban primacy, which is in Seoul specifically. Seoul is far and away the largest city in South Korea. It's at least 3 to 4 times larger than the second or smallest cities. It's the financial, cultural, political capital, and it's an example of urban primacy. And in Tokyo, they have an example of what is a megapolis, and that is the Tokyo and Osaka metro areas have grown and sprawled so much that they've more or less merged into one big blob of an urban area that's called a megapolis. And the U.S. it's considered to have a megapolis from Washington, D.C. up to Boston. You have Washington, D.C., then Baltimore and Philly and New York and Boston, and all these big East Coast cities kind of run into each other to the point where it's almost one large metro region. And that is an example of a megapolis in the United States. So Seoul, Korea, again, is an example of urban primacy. Seoul, Korea, far and away the largest city, has about 10 million people. The greater metro area contains about 40% of the country's entire population in one metro area, and it's the cultural and economic heart of the country. Some people are very wary of urban primacy when you have one metro area that's dominant. Some people are concerned that it's too much economic and political power in one area, while the other people don't think it's as much of a concern. So here's a little example of how Japan grew after World War II into this large megapolis we mentioned about. The picture in purple shows Tokyo's growth from 1914 to 1946 after World War II, and then it's grown up through 2011. It did expand very rapidly after 2000, after World War II. We mentioned there was a big baby boom after World War II, and the economy started taking off in the 50s and 60s. And now the greater Tokyo metro area has about 32 million people. And the urban area linking Tokyo and Osaka is about 300 miles, and this 300-mile stretch of land is almost a nonstop city and urban, the entire area along this 300-mile stretch. So because Japan is urban in Tokyo specifically, they've invested a lot of money in their train system. They have 200-mile-an-hour bullet trains that they started developing in the mid-1960s, and they're about 625 miles of lines. The fastest train in the U.S. is the Acela line. It goes between D.C. and New York, and it has a top speed of about 120 miles an hour and usually cruises around 80 miles an hour, and that's considered fast by our standards. But decades ago, Tokyo and Japan had trains that were going 200 miles an hour. The picture on the top right is of a magnetic levitation train, and some people think this may be the next big thing in high-speed rail. These maglev trains have been tested under ideal conditions and have reached speeds of up to 374 miles an hour. So that's even about 170 miles an hour faster than a typical bullet train. So that's incredibly fast. The key, of course, to any high-speed train is you have to have straight tracks. You can't have anything going fast if it's going around sharp curves. And that's somewhat of a problem in the U.S. We have rails that are very curvy and old, and in order to straighten them out, you'd have to buy property and tear down buildings, and that's very difficult to do in the U.S. because we have greater property rights than in other countries. So it's tough to build a straight track in the U.S. compared to other countries. In addition to high-speed rail, Japan has also had a long history of small apartments. The picture on the bottom left is of the Nakhigen Capsule Tower, built in Japan in the 1960s. And these were basically concrete apartments that were mass-produced and then kind of stacked on top of each other like Legos. And this is an idea that's been done in a couple other parts of the world too. And it's an interesting idea. Now these capsules that were originally built as apartments are actually kind of fashionable, and some of them are used as apartments still, and some of them are used as offices. So this region of East Asia is culturally unified by Confucianism and a similar writing system. Ancient Chinese civilizations emerged about 4,000 years ago. At first, they were somewhat isolated from one another, and then they started to grow into smaller and then larger kingdoms. But the region is somewhat unified with a similar culture, history, and written language. The written language in these areas is a ideographic writing system. The Chinese writing system is called kanji. And basically that is a writing system where instead of having a letter representing a sound, you have a letter representing a word or an idea, almost like visual sign language. So it's very different than most Latin-based languages or most other languages outside of this region. And Confucianism is a philosophy intended to create social stability that originated in this region in about 500 BC. And and then it became more common around the region. So here's an example of the Chinese writing system. Writing systems in East Asia are ideographic writing system, meaning you write something that represents an idea or a word as opposed to a sound. And this is an example of what George W. Bush is translated into Mandarin Chinese, and also Obama translated into Mandarin Chinese. And the writing systems can be traced to the earliest Chinese civilizations. Japan also has a writing system that is somewhat like the Chinese writing system. The spoken language of Japan is very different than Chinese. Japanese sounds different. They wouldn't be able to understand each other, but their writing systems are somewhat similar. The writing system of Japan is very complex because it was originally based off of the Chinese writing system of kanji, and then it later evolved into a more modern version of the Japanese writing system. And Korean, it also has a writing system that is ideographic, but the spoken language is different. Some of the religions that are common in East Asia is Mahayana Buddhism, and Buddhism is focused on a quest of reaching the state of nirvana, and followers of Buddhism sometimes can practice other religions. And Japan has Shintoism, and Shintoism might be considered somewhat of a local religion, maybe an animist religion, because people who follow Shintoism, the religion is tightly linked to the land and ancestral worship, and it's something that is unique to Japan. It's not a global religion where people who believe in it try to spread it to other countries like Christianity or Islam, so it's often tied to Japanese nationality. The picture on the bottom right is a Buddhist temple in Japan. And these are some interesting Shinto shrines in Japan. They have a lot of incredibly beautiful Shinto shrines. They're usually red. Some Shinto shrines are actually deliberately built not to last forever. Sometimes a Shinto shrine will be built to last for a fixed amount of time, say 20 or 40 years, after which it will be dismantled or even burned down and then rebuilt. The idea is the practice of building the shrine is a sense of worship in itself, and the skills needed to build the shrine are something they want to pass on to future craftsmen. So rather than build a church that's designed to last hundreds of years, as in parts of Europe, some Shinto shrines are made out of wood and perishable materials and are not really designed to last forever. The picture on the bottom left is the Itushimura Jina Shinto Shrine near Hiroshima, and then the Kanda Shrine near Tokyo is on the top right, and then the Kamano Nachi Tushi Shrine near Nachi Falls is on the bottom right. And Nachi Falls is about 370 feet high. So these are just some examples of the beautiful Shinto shrines they have in Japan. Some other religions, Taoism is a minority religion in this region. It stresses nature worship and spiritual harmony. And if you've ever heard feng shui, sometimes it's used a lot to sell furniture in an interior design, but it's actually tied to this religion. It's the idea that objects in your surroundings create a pleasant feeling that, I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's good to have an environment that makes you feel comfortable as a way of reducing stress. You could call that feng shui. Christianity and Islam are also fairly large minority religions in this region, and a large number of people in this region, especially in Japan and China, are secular, meaning they're not necessarily associated with any particular faith. Interestingly enough, the largest church in the world is in South Korea. There's a massive non-denominational megachurch in South Korea that has hundreds of thousands of worshipers and hundreds of thousands of members near Seoul. After World War II, the U.S. occupied South Korea and fought with the South Koreans against the North. And because of that, some Christian missionaries came to South Korea, and now there's a very large Catholic and Christian population, non-denominational Protestant, in South Korea. About 35% of South Korea, I believe, considers themselves to be Christian. Here are some of the linguistic and ethnic diversity in the area. These are basically just an example of the different languages in the area. Japan and Korea are considered to be their own languages, and then there are a large number of Chinese languages that are interrelated called Sino-Tibetan languages, and that includes Mandarin Chinese, the most common language spoken in China, and a lot of other Chinese languages that are related to Mandarin but are considered separate languages. So a lot of linguistic diversity in the region. The writing systems are similar, but the languages that are spoken are quite diverse. Language and nationality and national identity is a big issue in the region, especially in Japan. Japan has a very small ethnic group, kind of like the Native Americans of Japan, called the Ainu. And the Ainu are thought to be the people who originally inhabited Japan thousands of years ago. And then about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, people from mainland China started migrating to Japan. And those people evolved into what we now consider the Japanese. And this small ethnic group called the Ainu are basically the original inhabitants of Japan before this large migration that happened thousands of years ago. Koreans are also an ethnic minority in Japan, and then in China they have also some small groups of Korean populations and a few other different ethnic groups too. Officially, the Ainu are only about 25,000. Unofficially, their estimates are a little larger, perhaps 200,000. But it's a very small group of indigenous Japanese people in Japan. Languages are also interesting in Korea because North and South Korea speak Korean, but as the two countries have been separated during the Cold War, there has been sort of a drifting apart of the different languages. North Koreans now have a distinct accent compared to South Korea, almost a different dialect. And this sometimes happens when you have two groups of people that speak a common language, but then they're separated. The languages can drift apart from each other and sometimes even evolve into completely separate languages. Iceland was settled by Norwegian explorers in the Middle Ages, and now the people in Iceland speak a language very similar to what Norwegian would have probably been like in Norway about 1,000 years ago. They kind of drifted apart. And that's the situation in the Korean Peninsula. Taiwan has lots of different languages. The main language is similar to Han Chinese, and then there are other smaller languages that are spoken within there. Interestingly enough, in North Korea, one of the very few Western novels that they not only allow people to read but encourage is Gone with the Wind. North Koreans really love Gone with the Wind for some reason. It could be because the main villains in Gone with the Wind were the Federalists, you know, the Union Army, the United States. And apparently a lot of North Koreans empathize with Scarlett Johansson and the Confederacy and their fight against the North and so on. So for whatever reason, Gone with the Wind is a real big, well-liked, popular book in North Korea. One of the few Western books that they not only allow but encourage people to read. So in southern China, there's lots of different diversity of languages. We talked about how Mandarin Chinese is the most common spoken one, but in southern China it's very diverse. And here you have a combination of Mandarin and a lot of other languages that are Khmer Rouge. It has 11 different languages within that one subgroup. And then Kadi has 10 different languages. So in this region, you'll have hundreds of different languages spoken in addition to Mandarin. So lots of different linguistic diversity in southern China. So this region is a region that has had a significant amount of outside influences over it in the form of European influences, and it also has had a lot of cultural exports. Kung Fu movies are a big cultural export that became popular in the US in the 1970s. Of course, that's Bruce Lee on the top. And also K-pop, Korean pop culture, Korean pop music is really popular. For China and Japan have their pop stars, but for whatever reason, K-pop is super popular in Japan and China, and there are even some people in the US who follow it. And then North Korea is very isolated from the rest of the region as far as culture goes. But it's had significant cultural influences that is absorbed from outside and also exported elsewhere. Anime is also very popular in Japan. Apparently there's a huge genre of cartoons called anime out of Japan. I don't know much about it, but apparently a lot of the cartoons are real well thought out with more adult plots and not really kiddie cartoons that we're used to. One of my students about a year ago told me about anime in class, and he's talking about all these different films and how they have real interesting, well thought out characters, and how although it's a cartoon, it's written on a much higher level than a kid's cartoon. So Japanese animation, or anime, is a big popular cultural export. So here's the geopolitical framework. This is an area that had been significantly influenced by European powers, and some of the current issues in the area are disputes about some northern islands in Japan between Japan and Russia. At the end of World War II, of some islands that were in northern Japan were occupied by the Soviet Union, who at the time were our allies. So we didn't think much of it, but now those islands are being used by the Soviets or by the Russians to listen in on sub-activity in the region. There are also military bases in Okinawa, which are a bunch of islands that are part of Japan but are south of mainland Japan. They have a large military presence in them. There are numerous islands in East China that are disputed. China and Japan and Taiwan and other countries claim that these small islands are their country because there's a rule where land within 200 miles of your territory, of your island, is your exclusive economic zone. So the idea is if China or Japan or Vietnam can claim these islands as part of their country, then a 200-mile-an-hour buffer around them is theirs, and they can search for oil and natural gas in that area. So that's causing a lot of tension in the region. Who controls numerous islands in the East China and South China Sea? And there are skirmishes between India and China, and there are some disputes along the Indian-Chinese border. So those are some major issues of the region. In the 17 and 1800s, different European countries, especially Great Britain, started to invade and occupy different parts of China. They wanted a lot of the stuff that China was selling, but interestingly enough, the only thing China wanted from Europe was silver. They didn't care about some of the technology. They didn't care about the manufactured goods. All they wanted was silver. But Great Britain didn't want to give up their silver. So what they did is they got a lot of people hooked on opium, and they started trading opium to different parts of China in exchange for porcelain and tea and what they wanted from China. So they would go to one part of the region and purchase opium, go to a different part of the region, and then sell opium to the people of China in exchange for porcelain and silk and other things. And that actually erupted into a series of wars in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, where basically Great Britain forced China to open up trade and allow them to trade opium for the different things that they wanted. Here's a map of different imperial influence in China in roughly the late 1800s. Blue is the British sphere of influence, orange is French, green is Russian. As you can see, lots of different European powers have areas that had significant influence, that they had significant influence over. And then this blue barrier you see here is the Japanese Empire at the height of World War II in 1943. Japan invaded and occupied large portions of East Asia and this region. During World War II, they conquered the Philippines, large chunks of China, the Korean Peninsula, and other parts of the area. And the U.S. and our allies eventually beat them back during World War II with help from Filipinos and other countries in the region. Japan didn't really think that they were invading the Pacific. They thought they were kicking out these European interlopers and simply replacing them with themselves. So, for instance, Singapore, which is on the bottom of the Malay Peninsula, was a British colony. Japan invaded it, they kicked out the British, and as far as they were concerned, they liberated the people of Singapore from these foreign colonists. And although they also colonized these areas, they thought, well, at least that they were Asian, and better to be colonized and occupied by an Asian power than by some foreign European power. So Japan, in their mind, didn't necessarily think they were invading this area in purple. They thought they were liberating this region from European colonial powers. And Japan actually, in the 15 and 1600s, they were starting to increase trade with Europe. And in the early 1600s, they turned inward. There was a shogunate who took control in the early 1600s and united Japan and essentially kicked out all European influences and closed off the country to outside influences and put severe restrictions on trade. There was a massive purge of Christians. There were already a few Christians in the region at that time, and they were forced to convert or they were executed. So there's kind of a purging of foreign influences in Japan in the early 1600s. And then in the 1850s, the U.S., under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, sent a gunboat to Japan in 1853, and essentially they forced Japan to open up their country to U.S. influence and trade. The U.S. was concerned that if we didn't build ties with Japan, other European countries would get there, and then they would build up ties with Japan, and we might be at some strategic and economic disadvantage. So basically, the U.S. forced Japan to open up from this 220-year period of isolation and become more modern and trade with the U.S. and other European powers. Japan, after this point, actually quickly started to adopt Western weapons and technology, and then very quickly industrialized. And then from 1853 to the 1940s, they were one of the few countries that had airplanes and aircraft carriers. So in 90 years, they rapidly developed from almost a medieval technology to technology that rivaled the U.S. During World War II. So again, some post-war politics. These are some of the islands that are disputed in South China and East China Sea. They're often very small islands. Some of them are barely even above water at high tide, but a lot of countries are fighting over these because if they control these islands, the assumption is they'll be able to control the water around them. There's a growing military force in China, and Japan is wondering how to best respond to this. Should they also grow their military? There's been tensions with China and, again, a lot of their neighbors over these islands. And there's also a strong anti-Japanese feeling in China. During World War II, Japan occupied parts of China and committed significant atrocities. They also occupied parts of the Korean Peninsula and did the same thing. Young women were forced to basically become prostitutes for Japanese soldiers. There was looting. There were cities that were burned. It was really a very horrific, difficult time for countries that were occupied by Japan. And China, and to a lesser extent Korea, never think Japan really fully owned up to what they did. And China has complained that Japan doesn't talk about the atrocities they committed during World War II in Japanese textbooks. And this has created some hard feelings to this day between China and Japan. You'll find very few Japanese cars in China for that reason. Although China actually, apparently, they like Buicks. They buy a lot of Buicks there. So North Korea, the Cold War really never ended in Korea. After World War II, North Korea was under the control or the influence of communist North Korea. And the southern half roughly was free and had close ties to the U.S. And then in 1950, North Korea launched an attack against South Korea. The U.S. came to their aid, pushed the North Koreans back above the 38th parallel, pushed them back to near the Chinese border. Then China was concerned that the U.S. was getting too close to their border. They entered the war on behalf of the North Koreans. They pushed the U.S. and our allies back down to roughly the 38th parallel, and then the war dragged on for about 2 more years at roughly this fixed line along the 38th parallel. Eventually, after 3 years of fighting, an armistice was declared. There was never any official peace that was declared, just a ceasefire. And then a line was basically set up along roughly the 38th parallel, and both armies retreated 1 kilometer from that line. And that 2-kilometer strip separating the north and south is what's now known as the demilitarized zone. And it's basically a no man's land covered with landmines and fortifications and between these 2 countries. So then after World War II, South Korea invested in trade, and especially since the 1960s, the economy's grown very rapidly, while North Korea has remained somewhat backwards and isolated. North Korea has invested heavily in their nuclear weapons program, and you've probably heard in the news that's a major concern that the U.S. has. North Korea almost certainly has nuclear weapons, And the concern is that they might be able to miniaturize these nuclear weapons and put them on interballistic missiles that might be capable of hitting the U.S. They don't have the technology yet, but the concern is someday they might be able to do that. It's very unlikely North Korea would ever launch a nuclear attack on the U.S. because that would invite an immediate retaliation against them, but nonetheless, it's a major concern the U.S. has and our allies as well. So the civil war between communists and nationalists in China, we talked about how Korea was divided between North and South. Shortly after World War II in the late 1940s, there was also fighting in China between a communist Red Army and a democratic, what's called White Army. And the communist Red Army eventually won, and the leadership of the White Army evacuated China and moved to what is now Taiwan. So the country of Taiwan was set up by pro-democracy Chinese soldiers who lost to the communists in the late 1940s. And now Taiwan is officially recognized as part of China by China and the United States, but it's understood that they're going to be given a certain amount of autonomy from mainland China. Taiwan has their own Olympic team, their own economy. So basically, it's kind of an unusual situation where China sees them as a renegade province and part of mainland China, while Taiwan considers themselves to be an independent country. And there's an unwritten agreement between the U.S., Taiwan, and China that they're recognized as part of mainland China as long as they're given autonomy. Recently, China and Taiwan have actually been working to improve relations and better integrate their economies. So tensions between these two countries have been eased slightly compared to how they were 15 or 20 years ago. China has had a lot of land since World War II that they have taken over. We talked about how they've gotten back Hong Kong from Great Britain. Like Hong Kong, the Portuguese also had a colony called Macau. It's about 2 hours to the west of Hong Kong. That is also land that has been turned over back to mainland China. So China has been reasserting its power over these regions in recent years. And Hong Kong and Macau have some autonomy from the central Chinese government, again, somewhat like Puerto Rico might have with the U.S. But many people in Hong Kong especially are worried that they're losing their independence, and China, mainland China from Beijing, is pushing for greater influence over their country. So during the Cold War, there were alliances between the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea, and America, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And these alliances, even though the Cold War has ended, have remained mostly in place. Russia now has somewhat close relations with China and North Korea, and the U.S., Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea are also, along with Australia, allied against potential Chinese encroachment into their water and into their rights. So the geopolitical framework that evolved after World War II is still somewhat in place. There are a lot of disparities economically and socially in the region. There's a significant difference between, say, North Korea and South Korea when it comes to life expectancy and percent of population living below $2 a day and so on. The Human Development Index, again, the higher the better, is high in South Korea and Japan and Hong Kong, a little less in China. And in North Korea and Taiwan, there actually is no data available. Life expectancy in China is 75. Hong Kong is very high at 84. The U.S. hits about 80. North Korea is 70, so significantly lower than Japan or China. South Korea is 82, and then Taiwan is 80. So pretty high, except Japan, China a little lower at 75, and North Korea significantly lower at 70 for average life expectancy. Under age 5 mortality rate, China and North Korea is relatively high at 49, and South Korea and Taiwan is significantly less. Japan is 6 and South Korea is 8. Again, that's a number of people per 100,000 that die before the age of 5, so the lower the better. Gender inequality index. Not a tremendous amount of information. Hong Kong, there's no information available. North Korea, Taiwan, no information available. But the role of women in this region is somewhat traditional. There are not a large number of women in high-ranking public office. Japan is a little better, South Korea is a little better, but China, relatively few women in high positions of power, and same with North Korea. So vast disparities in economic and social well-being in the region, with North Korea in the bottom of the pack in most categories. So Japan's economy, we mentioned it boomed after World War II. Since the late 80s, it has had a lot of booms and busts. Because it has an aging population, there just aren't a lot of young consumers to create more people and customers to drive consumer demands. There's also very low fertility rates. The cost of living is very high. It has a somewhat inflexible workforce. So although the unemployment rate is relatively low, the country has large debts, an aging population, and many people are concerned that there simply won't be enough people in the workforce to work and pay into the tax system and take care of the older people. This has already been a significant problem in Japan, and it will probably get worse as the population ages. Thriving economies in South Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong. These countries have a little more stable population, not as old as Japan. South Korea has had an export economy. There's a lot of technology developed in South Korea. Hong Kong is a major financial center, although Tokyo is probably the biggest financial center in the region. Taiwan and Hong Kong have had rapid growth since the 1960s, and those countries, especially Taiwan, have had a laissez-faire attitude towards economics, meaning they've tried to have as few government regulations restricting economics as possible. And these three countries have done very well and are a little better off compared to Japan because of the younger population than Japan. South Korea has had some problems with protests and political instability. Their president, a female president named Park, had to resign and actually was arrested during a corruption probe, and she might be charged with corruption. So there's been some political instability in South Korea, but these three countries have done fairly well economically. So China has invested a lot of money in trade along some of the major coastal cities. In the early 90s, they set up what are called special economic zones. And basically, these are free trade zones with very minimum taxes and minimum regulation. And these zones were set up to try to encourage foreign investment. And by most accounts, they've been very successful. Many of the cities that had SEZs have grown very rapidly in the last 30 years, including Shenzhen, a city that barely existed 30 years ago, is now a city of about 15 million people. So by setting up areas of low taxes that encourage foreign investments, they've had a lot of growth. This here is gross domestic product by administrative division, somewhat like a state in the U.S. And as you can see here, the darker purple it is, the wealthier it is. The areas that had the SEZs on the coasts have become relatively wealthy. And generally, as you get further into the interior, where you're less integrated into the global economy, it usually is a little poorer. And Tibet and Yuan in the south and others are relatively poor, and most of the wealth is in the large booming coastal cities, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and elsewhere. So there's been some criticism of the growth that China has had. There's been complaints about a trade imbalance between the U.S. and China. This really isn't surprising, since labor is simply so much cheaper in China. It's easier to make things in China and have them sent to the U.S. than the other way around. China simply doesn't have China makes mass-produced cheap toys, and the U.S. makes Boeing 747s. So we tend to focus on expensive high-end goods that only wealthy countries can buy, while China tends to focus on mass-produced inexpensive things. But this has created a trade imbalance where we're buying a lot more from China than they are from us. And some politicians don't think it's a big issue, while others are very concerned with it. There's also been complaints about very poor working conditions in Chinese factories, low pay, working conditions that aren't safe, young children working in factories. The picture on the bottom right, you'll see a bunch of factories that have nets that have been strung out along the sides of their buildings. And the reason is there were multiple incidences of people committing suicide by jumping out of windows. So in order to fight against it, they actually set up nets to catch people who were jumping out of windows, killing themselves. So that's pretty sad that those would be necessary. but the working conditions in Chinese factories have been harshly criticized for being poor and unsafe. China had a one-child policy that they implemented to try to curb what they were afraid was going to be out of control population growth that would put a tremendous strain on natural resources and food. That has been significantly successful. The growth of China has significantly slowed down to the point where they've actually eliminated the one-child policy in some of the more rural parts of the country. And now they have a new two-child policy. And now they're actually concerned that they might have labor shortages. They're concerned that the one-child policy has been so effective, they might not have enough workers, and they might be dealing with what Japan is dealing with now, 10 or 20 years in the future, an old workforce and not enough young people working to pay taxes and helping to support the older people. The region in general has had, again, like we said, a gender imbalance. Women still are not as properly represented in East Asia as they are in, say, parts of Western Europe. Not a lot of women in high-ranking positions of power, but we've seen an exception with President Park in Korea. And the social position of women in this region is still somewhat more traditional compared to the rest of the world. Although Korea and Japan does have a very large number of women who are college educated. So North Korea is almost a completely separate country from the rest of the region when it comes to economics and trade and everything else. They've had lots of problems with human rights abuses, a lack of basic services. We saw the picture of an aerial photo of North Korea, and it was almost completely black compared to South Korea. They've had a rejection of globalization. And there's a very interesting TED Talk that I posted that talks about a woman who was arrested in North Korea and the things that her captors expected from her and what she thought they would be like. And it's really fascinating. Make sure you watch that video. But it's an insular, inward, backward country compared to the rest of the region. So a quick recap. East Asia is defined as a world region in Chapter 11, which of the following is not part of East Asia, and that is India. That's part of South Asia. We'll be talking about that next week, that region. Climates along the coastline of East Asia are very similar to, and that is North America. The region in general has a climate similar to North America because it's at the same latitude as North America. Most serious environmental issues facing East Asia are in China. Japan, North Korea, South Korea, and Taiwan either have tighter rules and regulations restricting pollution, or North Korea simply isn't developed, so it's not as much of an issue. Which East Asian city is a global financial center? That is Tokyo. Hong Kong is also very influential, but Tokyo is the financial center of East Asia. Metropolitan area has grown together to form an enormous urban complex is termed, and that is megapolis. And again, Tokyo and Osaka is an example of that in Japan, and the Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston metro megapolis is an example of that in the U.S. Most distinctive cultural aspect of East Asia is the written language. They have a written language that is ideographic, meaning that it has words that represent ideas, or words rather than a letter that represents a sound that is built up into a word. So it's unique to that region. One of the most laissez-faire economic systems in the world can be found in Hong Kong. South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan have somewhat limited government, but compared to Hong Kong has very limited government and very limited, it's very laissez-faire in Hong Kong compared to the rest of the region. Economic development is measured in GDP in China, reflects the formation of special economic zones associated with trade along which area, and that is D, the Pacific. As you can see here, the regions along the Pacific have closer ties to the global economy and have had a lot of foreign investment in them and have become relatively wealthy because of it. All right, if you have any questions, email me at wrenando@jccmi.edu. After this chapter, we have a chapter on South Asia, then one chapter on Southeast Asia, and then the final exam, which will be like the midterm. It will cover chapters 9 through the last chapter. And let me know if you have any questions. Have a good day.